Welcome to Linked Data Engineering. This is lecture number 5, Linked Data Mashups and Applications. While in the last part of the lecture you have learned how to publish linked data in general, in this part we will talk about best practices that should be considered when publishing linked data. So just as a reminder, the linked data principles. Of course, you should use URIs to name things when you publish linked data, and of course you should use HTTP URIs so that people are able to look up those names. And of course, you should provide useful information in the sense that you are using the W3C standards, RDF and SPARQL, and most important of all, include other links to other URIs so that the user is able to discover more knowledge, more things which in the linked data cloud. So these, only as a reminder, the linked data principles. But what about best practices? How do I do this in practice? Okay, so let's consider you are in some kind of organization and you think, yep, we would benefit if our data would also be published as linked data. So first thing you have to do in your organization, prepare the stakeholders by explaining the process of creating and maintaining linked open data, because only if they understand what is the effort that has been invested, and on the other hand, what are the benefits, then they can support your decision in providing linked open data. And for doing this, of course, there have been published several models how this process of linked data publishing can be maintained. So these are usual projects related to, for example, government data, which should be published on the web, like this one from Highland and Wood, or also here this one. These are guidelines for publishing government linked data from Boris Villason Terrazas. So I have provided you links for that, and you can use, of course, these documents that explain the linked data publication process to your stakeholders. Okay, so we have to prepare the stakeholders that they can really make a thoughtful decision about the publication of linked data. Then, of course, you should definitely select the data set that provides some benefit for others to reuse. So if the data set is only for use of yourself, there might be a potential benefit for others. You don't know. But of course, go for this data set first that definitely provides benefits for others, because then it will be used by others, it will be complemented by others with their own data, and of course this is what you are after. You want to have these connections and you want to have other people to connect to your data, to use your data, because then it becomes more valuable. So the selection of the data set is the second most important thing. Next, of course, you should think about how to model your data. So model the data by representing data objects, and think about how you can do this in an application independent way, because it's not only you and your application that is using this data. You should think of your modeling strategy like other people also want to use your data for completely different applications. So therefore, best you can do is model your data in an application independent way according to the available W3C standards. Okay, so now we know how to model our data, and if we provide data somehow on the web, we must think about probable the choice of license. So what kind of license should I choose? So it's linked open data, therefore of course it's best if you make this data also freely available, but nevertheless you have to choose an appropriate open data license. There are several or many different choices to make. So for example, you can look at Creative Commons licenses, and also the Open Knowledge Foundation provides some data licenses which take care about questions: who and for what can I use these data? How is reuse of my data regulated? What about redistribution? What about any commercial use of this freely published data? And is attribution necessary? Is it not necessary? So you see, there are many things to consider and to think about. So therefore, choose the appropriate open data license. And of course, when you publish your data, make clear under what license terms this data has been published. Okay, next very important thing, consider well what kind of URI naming strategy you use. We will see also in the next part of the lecture some examples how you do this. If you don't have already available URIs, how you should choose a naming strategy and an implementation plan for that. And of course, you should use HTTP URIs because linked data only makes sense if it's available on the web. So therefore, of course, HTTP URIs. And make it clear or make sure that there is also a machine-readable version of the resources under the same URI via content negotiation. We know about that. And of course, you should use somehow persistent URIs. Make sure that these URIs don't vanish after 1 or 2 months. So also after some time, it should be possible to get the data via the same URI. So therefore, this URI should be somehow persistent. Only this makes sense. It should not change dynamically because then this data again would be lost. Next point, of course, we have to think of how to encode our data, and therefore please, whenever possible, use already previously defined vocabularies, because the more often these vocabularies are used, the more clear it is what you mean with that. So therefore others can connect it and you can relate it to other data which has been encoded with exactly the same vocabulary. Of course, not always the existing vocabularies match to what you have in mind exactly. Then you always have the way to extend these standard vocabularies whenever necessary. And if nothing else helps, I mean, in the least consequence, you have to create a new vocabulary, but only when required. And when you do that, then of course follow the best practices whenever possible. You might ask now, where do I find previously defined vocabularies? So a good point to start looking would be linked open vocabularies. I have given you the link here, and they, of course, they gather vocabularies. They have several hundreds of vocabularies, and you can also get some information of how often vocabularies, for example, are used to make a choice. What is the most popular or the most or the best vocabulary to choose for a specific thing? So this is a good starting point for choosing a vocabulary. And then, of course, you have to encode your data via W3C standards. So somehow it must be represented in RDF, and you have to think about, do I provide it in JSON-LD, in Turtle, in RDF XML, in RDFA, in whatever, or do I provide all of these forms? So your data has to be converted to a linked data representation in the end. But there, of course, the process does not stop. Usually you should provide various ways also for search engines and other automated processes to access your data using standard web mechanisms. So you have the direct URI resolution, which is the URI, HTTP URI lookup. So this is often referred to as follow your nose access. Then you might provide a RESTful API, you might provide a SPARQL endpoint, and also you might provide files for download. So these are then dump files where you put simple RDF for download on the web. And then, of course, if nobody knows that there is new data, of course, nobody will use it. So therefore, you have to announce your new data set on an authoritative domain. So for example, you can go to CKAN, or you can look up where you can find linked open data, and there you can, of course, announce that you provide a new data set. So as a linked open data publisher, it's also important that you know that you make a social contract. You provide data. And of course, if people rely on you that you provide data, you should also, and this is very important, number 10, recognize your responsibility in the maintenance of this data once it is published. So you have to ensure that your data set will remain available. So it should be available exactly there where your organization stays, and it will be also maintained over time. This is really important because you will see that many of the data sets that are available and where you will find URIs are not available anymore. They are not maintained, or there's a SPARQL endpoint which once has been in service, now is out of service, and starts things like that. So this often, of course, is the case if the responsible person goes to another occupation, to another company, to another job, or leaves the university that has published all the linked data. Then sometimes, of course, there is no maintenance. And then this data, again, which is often rather valuable, might be lost. So therefore, please recognize your responsibility for maintenance. If you want to know more about these best practices, of course, W3C has published a guide, Best Practices for Publishing Linked Data, in 2014, and just follow the link and you can reread all the things that I have told you here in a quick summary. So, these are the best practices. In the next part of the lecture, we will publish our own linked data.